So this is chapter 3, and this is the kind of the first, probably entirely new material chapter that many of you will see. Now, depending on who you had as a professor for Econ 130, you may have found that there was some time to cover indifference curves and budget constraints, but even if you did, it would have been pretty rushed. And I can't imagine you would have dealt it certainly wouldn't have been its own chapter. It was the appendix to a chapter. And so that's really the focus here. We want to understand how consumers make decisions. That's the focus of this chapter, chapter 3, how consumers make decisions. Okay. So, the way that consumers make decisions, what we do is we understand them as maximizing something subject to a constraint. What they're maximizing is their happiness, which we understand in economics terms as utility. And the constraint that they face is their income. So, what that means is that there are three steps. The three steps here are consumer preferences. So, this here would be represented by what we're going to see called the indifference curve. So here is where we are maximizing utility or happiness. And here we've got our budget in our budget constraint. So we are maximizing utility subject to a constraint. And that consumer choice is where we put together the point where we are maximizing utility. Oh, yeah. Maximizing utility subject to the constraint. Okay. Now, I'll be honest, when I cover really when I cover any of these chapters, I don't think economics should be like a murder mystery. Right? We shouldn't have to wait till the end to see how things look. And so here's my basic, very quick understanding. So then imagine a space, not where there's demand and supply, but that there are two goods. So let's call this good one and good two. Okay, so there's two things that consumers can buy. And what we would do is say, oh, a person will have, it's a horrible color to pick. A person will have this much happiness if they consume that quantity of one and that quantity of two. And they would have even more happiness if they consumed more of both goods. But what we're going to see is that we can draw a curve, and we'll talk about why this curve looks this way. But we're going to draw a curve that looks like this, which is called an indifference curve. It's a curve where the utility is constant, the happiness is constant. The further out the indifference curve, the greater the utility, the greater the happiness. But there's also a budget constraint, which represents me spending all of my income based on these two different goods. And do you see that point right there? That's step 3, where I'm seeking the highest indifference curve, this one right here, that's meeting the budget constraint. Because you can see there is that point there. There's even that point there. But the problem with those 2 points is they're on a lower indifference curve. This one's on a higher one. And so this picture right here is what we're going to be looking at in this chapter. Now, I know I went over that very quickly, but it gives you an idea of what to expect now as we go through the rest of these slides. Okay. So let's go back to step 1, the idea of the consumption patterns. So here, what we start off with is a notion of market baskets. And in these market baskets, we can think of having various levels of food and various combinations of clothing. But the basket contains the combination of both products. Okay. Now, what we care about is, does a consumer prefer one of these bundles over another? That's what we want to know when we're trying to understand this human behavior. So let's talk about what the assumptions are. What is it that we're assuming about these preferences? Each of these assumptions are important. So the first assumption is completeness. Basically, what this means is that there is some relationship between every bundle. And there's only 3 types of relationships that exist. Let's say there's only 2 bundles here, A and B. It has to be then that either A is preferred to B, B is preferred to A, or A is indifferent to B. Those are the only 3 relationships that exist. Is that you either prefer one bundle over the other bundle over the first bundle, or you don't care which one you get. When we say indifferent, as the last line here identifies, all that we're basically saying here is that the person would be equally happy having either bundle. Now, as the last line points out here, we're not talking about how much you have to pay for the bundles. All that we're talking about here is how much happiness they generate. So if you prefer A to B, A must produce more happiness than B. If you prefer B to A, then B must be producing more happiness. And if you're indifferent between the two, then they provide equal happiness or satisfaction. So that's our first assumption, completeness. Some relationship exists. Second is the second assumption is transitivity. What transitivity basically means is that everything is well ordered, everything is logical. I'm not going to rewrite this out here, but as the title, as the description describes it, if I prefer A to B and I prefer B to C, then logically I would have to prefer A to C. So it just makes sure that, as it says, that there's consistency in my preferences for the bundles. And then the other, the third assumption would be more is better than less. Or to be more formal, we could say that preferences that there's non-satiation, meaning that more is always better. So if a bundle has more of both goods, then it must be preferred. Now, with these assumptions in mind, let's just insert a slide here. And let's make it completely empty. Okay. So with that in mind, here's my quantity of x. Here's my quantity of good y. And here's a whole bunch of bundles, market baskets. Now, what we know, based on the assumptions, is that each of these bundles have a relationship with each other. My first question would be, what is the relationship between A and B? We know that B is preferred to A. We know that that's the case because B has more of good Y than A, and B has more of good X than A. So B must be preferred to A. What's the relationship between A and C? Same thing. C has more of good Y as well as more of good X, so C must be preferred to A. What about A to D? That we don't know. Because while A has more of Y than D, A has less of X than D. So it has more of one and less of the other. So we don't know enough yet. What about the relationship between B and C? We don't know. B has more of Y than C, but C has more of X than B. So what we would need to, the additional piece of information we would need to know is the indifference curves. So here's what we do. Just start to plot this out here. We start by drawing a little cross here. And what we know is that if you remember back to high school in quadrants, this is quadrant 1, this is quadrant 2, this is quadrant 3, and this is quadrant 4. Anything in quadrant 1 is preferred to C. C is preferred to quadrant 3. Consequently, quadrant 1 is preferred, to quadrant 3, right? That would just be by transitivity. But we know from completeness that there has to be some relationships between quadrant 2 and quadrant 4 as it relates to bundle C. That's where we need the additional information. So anything in quadrant 1 is preferred to C. C is preferred to anything in quadrant 3. What we don't know are those two bundles. And that's where we're going to need the indifference curve. So you can see this much better drawn picture here. E is preferred to A is preferred to G. You know that because E has more of both goods than A, and A has more of both goods than G. So E is preferred to A is preferred to G, E, consequently, E is preferred to G. But what we need to be able to draw here is an indifference curve, a line that will combine products of baskets of equal utility. So, um, this is what an indifference curve typically looks like. It's bowed inward towards the origin, and any bundle that is on that indifference curve is equal. So B is indifferent to A is indifferent to D. But we also know that there must be an indifference curve here. There must be an indifference curve here. And there must be an indifference curve here. Every point has an indifference curve that goes through it. And the higher out, the further from the origin the indifference curve, the more preferred it is. So again, along each of these, the utility, the total utility is constant, but let's call it U1, U2, U3. U3 is preferred to everything else. U2 is preferred to U1. U1 is the least preferred option, at least in the things that we have listed here. So when we draw those all out, we call that the indifference map, the tracing out of all the indifference curves that go through each of the points. Now, as you're looking at this, what you see is that they're all parallel to one another, and that's important because, as the next slide points out for us, indifference curves cannot intersect. And the reason why they cannot intersect is because it would essentially violate our assumption of transitivity. By that I mean A and B are indifferent because they're on the same indifference curve, U1. A and D are indifferent because they're on the same indifference curve, U2. By transitivity, we would have said B is indifferent to D, but it's not because B, by the very nature of more is always better, has more of both goods than D. So B must be preferred to D, yet the logic would have said that they should be indifferent to each other. And so, for that reason alone, indifference curves cannot intersect one another. The slope of the indifference curve is the marginal rate of substitution. Because what we're trying to do here is we're looking at our ability to substitute one good for the other and stay at the same total utility. Let's look at bundles A and B here. So let's just make this, sorry, let's just make this bigger here. So if we look at bundles A and B, to move from A to B requires a reduction of 6 units of clothing, but it takes only 1 unit of food to make up for the loss of 6 units of clothing. Why so much? Well, because at A you've got lots and lots of clothing, but very little food. And you could probably give up a great deal of food to just have some simple variety in your what you're eating. So here we can see that this is telling us the trade-off between the two goods that generates the same total utility. And as you can see here, the indifference curve gets flatter as we go left to right along the graph. The question would obviously be, why is that the case? Why is it the case that the indifference curve gets flatter as we go left to right? Why does the indifference curve get flatter as we move left to right? Why is it getting flatter? Right? Why is it getting flatter as we're moving along the indifference curve? It's not just um, not just a lucky guess. Instead, what we see is that these indifference curves, as I said before, these indifference curves are bowed inward towards the origin, or they are convex. And the reason why is that products have a diminishing marginal rate of substitution due to the law of diminishing marginal utility. Basically, when you're when you're wearing too many clothes, the amount of additional happiness you get out of clothes is very, very low because you have so much of it. Whereas food that you don't have a great deal of, having even just some simple variety would make you pretty happy. Okay. Now we can look at these indifference curves to also look at products that are perfect substitutes with one another and that are perfect complements with one another. And we could look at goods where either good X or good Y is a bad good. It's going to change the shape of the indifference curve. So let's first start look at perfect substitutes and perfect complements. Well, in the case of perfect substitutes, what you see is that the indifference curves are exactly parallel to one another and that they are linear to one another, meaning you are as equally willing to give up apple juice as you are to get orange juice. Um, it is not the case that consuming more apples or more oranges diminishes the marginal utility. The trade-off is always the same between the two. In the case of the perfect complements, the indifference curve is L-shaped. And the reason why that's the case is because you don't get the additional happiness unless you have a particular combination of the two products. Well, the example they give here is a pretty good example. and that would be left shoes and right shoes. Unless you're a pirate, um, you typically um, only get happy when you have the same number of left shoes as you do right shoes. I'm just again going to skip the example there. Um, Sorry, I don't know why they didn't write it out here. I'm going to squeeze it in here. Let me go back. Here we go. What about a bad good? Wait. In the case of a bad good, let's say that X is the bad good, then you want less of it to be preferred. So in this case, what you would see is that if good X was a bad good, then more of X is going to make you less happy. As opposed to Y being the bad good, which could get you indifference curves that are horizontal lines. So, um, again, we attach a utility number, kind of a satisfaction level, with each indifference curve. The further it is from the origin, the higher the utility number that's attached to it. And that person would be equally happy having any basket on that bundle. Now, keep in mind what these numbers represent. These numbers, the numbers that we attach to the um, utility, is rank ordered. It's ordinal, not cardinal. By that we mean is that if the number is, when we say that a number is ordinal, all we're saying is that if it's 2 and it's bigger than 1, then 2 is preferred to 1. But we can't say that 2 is twice as much as 1. Because in some sense, the numbers don't matter enough for us to be able to say that. As opposed to a cardinal utility function. Because it's in a cardinal utility function where you would say that 2 is twice as much as 1, so 2 must have twice as much satisfaction as 1. That's not generally how we work. We generally are using ordinal utility numbers. And so, with that understanding then of the indifference curve, we then need to think through the budget constraint. Okay, I'm just going to pause the video here. Okay, the second step to this is the budget constraint. It's the limited income. So the function for this would be your total income is equal to the price of the product times the quantity of the product plus the price of clothing in this case times the quantity of clothing. Now what you see here is that for spending, it's all constant here. So along the budget constraint, sorry, I'm going to change the thickness of the line here, I think. Um, I was trying to change the thickness of the pen, but I don't have that option, it looks like. You would think I would. You can add stickers. Look at that. Sorry, I'm really trying to figure this out here. Okay, well, I'll just live with how it is. You notice here that the income is always the same, 80. So now it's just based on my ability to spend that entire budget. Now, because the prices are not changing, that trade-off between the two will be constant, unlike it is for the indifference curve, where where the marginal utility from a product was actually changing. That would not be the case here. And so what we see here is that if food costs $1, clothing costs $2, that trade-off should always be 1 to 2, and negative because it's um, you're um, sacrificing one product to buy the other. So that slope is constant, and the slope of the budget constraint is basically the ratio of the prices. Sorry, I just want to make sure. No, they just really didn't want to show it to you. Okay, so I'll just make sure I show it before we get that far. Okay, so the slope here is the negative of the price of the good on the x-axis over the price of the good on the y-axis. That's the slope of the budget constraint. Now, I don't know why they didn't show it on that slide, but what about the slope of the indifference curve? Remember, it reflected how much satisfaction I got from each product. So in this case, it's going to be the marginal utility of the good on the x-axis over the marginal utility of the good on the y-axis. So that's our slope for the indifference curve. That's the marginal utility, or how much additional happiness I get from consuming good X over the additional happiness I get from consuming good Y. So what we could understand here is that as the income levels change, we would shift the budget constraint outwards or inwards, depending on whether it's increasing or decreasing. But as you'll notice here, at least on this one, for this scenario, if there's just an income change, then the budget constraints will be parallel to each other. If, however, I change the price of a product, you can see here, if the price of food is falling, then I can buy more of the product. Notice here that sorry, notice here that would be the x-intercepts is your total income divided by the price of the product. Here, your y-intercept would be your total income divided by the price of the y product. And as the price of good X is falling and the numerator is staying the same, the whole ratio is rising. And that's what you see here, a higher and higher number, due to the fact that food in this case became less expensive. And so that leads us to our third step, which is now our ultimate consumer choice. That ultimate consumer choice is basically going to be, if I had to write it out, it's your highest indifference curve that is just tangent to the budget constraint. Or it's where the slope of the budget constraint is equal to the slope of the indifference curve. Or, if I rearrange the terms, that becomes a pretty important graph. The negative signs will cancel each other off here. What that tells us is that the marginal utility per dollar spent is equal across the two goods at the point of optimality. Essentially, what that means is that if something costs twice as much, it will generate twice as much happiness. And if it doesn't, then you would need to consume more of that product. What if this wasn't true? So, what if MUX over PX was greater than MUY over PY? Then what would you do? You'd buy more of X because X is making you happier per dollar spent. What happens though as you buy more? Does the price change? No. Does the marginal utility change? Yes. So as you buy more of X, the marginal utility of X falls. And it falls and falls until the ratio is equal, back over here. Same with the alternative. If MUX over PX is less than MUY over PY, then people will buy more Y, which causes marginal utility of Y to fall. until they're equal to each other. So you basically get to an equilibrium point where I'm seeking the highest indifference curve that's going to be just tangent to the budget constraint. And so what you can see here is that if we draw these all out, we know D is preferred to A because D is on a higher indifference curve than A. But what's the problem with point D? We can't afford it. The budget constraint doesn't even touch D. So D is unaffordable. What about A and B? A and B are both on the same budget line. So they're both affordable. But we know that there has to be some relationship between A and B. And we know that A and B are not indifferent because A and B are in different indifference curves. A is on a higher one. So we know that A must be preferred to B. But what's also happening at B? If you were to look at this closely, what you would see is that at B, the slope of the budget constraint, it's steeper than the indifference curve. Or in other words, that px over py is greater than mux over muy. Or changing the terms, so at B, basically the problem is that I'm not consuming enough of the product on the x-axis, food, and I'm consuming too much of the product on the y-axis, clothing. As we did in the previous slide, right, we would say then that the person should buy more food to go on the x-axis. And as they do that, we get closer to a point like A. And you can see that this indifference curve just touches the budget constraint. And that would be our optimal point. Okay. So I've already talked about this. I'm not going to talk about this longer here. And I'm going to skip the example. Now, it is possible to get what's called a corner solution. Corner solutions are somewhat unique, so I'm not exactly sure why they want to show it to you, but they do. Basically, what a corner solution does is it forces the consumer to buy only that one product because of the way that the indifference curves are shaped. So the person would only be happy consuming basically the x-intercept of the indifference curve and budget constraint. And even then, it's not going to be good enough. How do we get that? Basically, you only really want the corner solution emerges when the one product may be wanted, but it's not very valuable. It doesn't make a lot of happiness. Whereas the good on the x-axis, in this case ice cream, does generate a great deal of happiness. And then again, I'm going to skip the examples here, if only because, again, they're not, I haven't found them generally to be very useful. Um, the last kind of part to this would be to talk about my revealed preferences. And that's going to lead us then to our marginal utility. But essentially, it's that with revealed preferences, um, we basically, it would be the way that we show what is preferred or not. And what it does for us here is we basically know that any points below below that at least part of the triangle, is affordable, but you're not spending all of your income. D is not affordable, at least when it comes to I1, but it is affordable when it comes to I2, budget constraint number 2. Um, and in this case, if they bought bundle D um, can't be purchased with the market conditions that exist at budget constraint number 1. Um, essentially, we would need more information about how the price changed to change us from I1 to I2. To be able to talk about what the relationship is between points A, B, and D, knowing that some relationship must exist. Anything in the orange region would be strictly preferred because it has more of both goods. Again, the problems emerge when for a product you have more of one good but less of the other, and then we would basically need more information to talk about what's going on. Okay. I don't have really much more to say about it than what I've done here. I've actually already done this, so this was just the maths of saying that the optimal point is the point. Sorry, I'm trying to do this with my right hand, and I am left-handed. That what you can see here is that, again, this is my optimal consumer point. It's where the slope of the indifference curve is equal to the slope of my budget constraint. And you will see problems like this on the problem set, but I will do some practice ones for you to allow you to all get the hang of things. Okay. Let me make sure there's nothing a great deal more here. There is not. The last part to this chapter is the discussion of the cost of living indexes. I don't generally cover them. I don't think I ever have covered them when I've covered an intermediate microeconomics course, and so I'm not going to start now. I think it takes us away from trying to understand the complexity that is consumer choice. Okay. Um, this chapter is going to make a lot more sense, especially when we do the problems, and it gives me a chance to kind of review some of the definitions we have going on.